I'm using my cat Lily. She's a beautiful little calico for this project. And we're going to start with the drawing. I'm going to draw right on this canvas with paint. And what I like to do first is kind of get an idea of where the cat is going to sit on this canvas. A little lower than halfway up the canvas. And I want to fill the canvas. I don't want to just have a little cat in the bottom left corner. So I'm going to try and break things down into the most basic shapes to start. And I see a big circle, and that's kind of going to be the basic head shape. Now, if I grab a piece of clear acetate, I can place this down on top of that picture, and I'll draw that circle so you can get an idea of it. Okay, so it's fairly big on that canvas. There's not that much space on the right and the left hand side, and it's just below the halfway point, as I said. So the right and the left, not that much space. So I really want to fill that canvas with that oval. I'm just going to rough it in. I'm using paint here, and the blue paint will disappear later when I do the black and white painting on top, so don't worry about your drawing. It doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to break down simple shapes, starting with that oval. All right, so now looking at her directionality, she's looking down on an angle. And what I want to do after I clean up this circle shape is kind of get an idea of where, basic shapes are going to fall. All right, so not worrying about a perfect circle, but getting an idea of where things fall in this circle. So I'm going to move that aside here for a second just so we can take a look. From the right hand side of that circle, nothing comes straight down. Her nose comes down on an angle towards the bottom right corner, just a little bit. So I'm going to go to the circle. I know that I don't want to go straight down. I want to go on a bit of an angle down towards her nose. And then it's going to come in, and then her muzzle is a bit of another circle. And her nose is just a little line. And I'll talk about placement of that line and directionality of that line in a minute. We're going to go to the back of the head as well after we get this muzzle in here, and just determine kind of the rough angle of the back of her head. It kind of comes off the top of that circle and comes down. Maybe it comes down a little bit more. I can edit that later. Her chest, there's a lot of fur there. That'll also indicate directionality later, but for now, just get an idea of where the chest is. Now the nose, if we look at the nose and the angle of that nostril, it kind of comes up and cuts this circle in half. So if I look at my main circle and go from the nose up through the center of that circle, I'll get a pretty good angle for that nose. So that's the angle that I'm going to have on that nostril there. And that gives me a place to start for the eye. It's close to the bottom right-hand corner there of the head. And it's on an angle something like this. It's not like a T shape across that center line. It's like an X. It's making a bit of an X, not a T. So that's the angle of that eye, and it's a bit of an oval, an up and down oval, with an eyelid that's fairly horizontal to the bottom of that canvas, and then curves around to wrap around the eye pretty dramatically by going straight down. You can kind of see that there, that angle. Looking at the picture, you can really see what's happening there. Now for other elements, as I go in, thinking about things like where are the ears going to go, for example. I'm going to look at it here for a second. Those ears don't pop out much from the head. Not that forward ear anyway, that left-hand ear. So I'm going to line things up again, put that circle back, and the ear starts not that far from the inside top edge of that circle, and it hits that center line and then curves around again. Now I'm going to look at my circle here, and this is the halfway point of that circle right about here. And in my picture, the ear ends above that center point a little bit. So I'm just going to draw that curve. It's very much like an almond shape. The right ear is behind the head, and we just see the point of it. It's not as rounded It has a little bit of a roundness to it, but not much. It's just seeing the tip of it poking out there. And this is the basic drawing. There's more detail that we can do to this this cat, but we'll do that when we start painting her. For now, I just want the main elements broken down into the most simple shapes possible. Looking at my original circle and the fur of her head, you can kind of get some directionality on the way the fur's going, but also how that fur color in her head follows that circle around with just maybe a little bit of a dip in around her chin, right around there. A grisaille is basically a black and white or grayscale version of your subject matter, in this case the cat. And I'm just going to use 3 colors. I don't use black and white. Instead, I want you to use brown and blue mixed with white. And the reason is because with brown and blue I have so much more power over my grays. If I just use black out of the tube, I have less control. And so for me, if my color leans a little bit more bluish gray in some places and more brownish gray in the others, that's okay. In fact, adding a little bit more blue to the color will make the color darker. Adding more brown does tend to make it a little bit lighter, so I can go back and forth on that. But I'm just going to put out my color no less than about a nickel wide for those daubs of paint, and I'm just going to mix on the fly, but I really do recommend mixing with a palette knife whenever possible. A palette knife can give you better results because you can mix bigger blobs. I'm just going to start with my biggest brush, and I'm just going to dip it in the water a little bit because my first layer of paint I can always have it a little bit watery. And whether you're working with acrylic or oil, for oil you just have it be a little bit more watery, so to speak, by using a little bit of your fast dry medium or, you know, odorless mineral spirits. I don't like to work with odorless mineral spirits personally. I stick with my fast dry medium. So what I want to do is I'm just going to create my blacks. And so I'm just mixing that blue and that brown together and wiggling it into my brush. I look at my painting and I squint my eyes, and I'm just going to look for the shapes, the rough shapes that I see. And I'm painting them in really big. So basically this whole ear, whole half of the ear is dark. And part of the reason I use water as well is because I want to get rid of kind of that texture of the canvas, that weave. I can see through it. And with my darks, with acrylic and oil, I always go bigger than I need to go. So the color is always going to be bigger than it needs to be in the end. And if it's a little bit watery in the beginning, the value is not going to be where it needs to be at the end as well. So I'm just putting in this first layer of paint. I see the dark going right down underneath that eye, kind of down like this. So I'm just creating big shapes. This is nice and freeing. And this is part of the reason why my sample drawing, my first drawing, sorry, my sketch, doesn't have to be perfect, because I just want it to be the biggest shapes. Okay, I do see some darks, especially in that oval of the eye. It's like a nice line in the center and in the corner of the eye. I'll just paint that in. It's quite dark here in the crack of that nose, and there's a few patches down here and on the back of her fur. Okay, now as I go along, I'm going to start using a smaller brush. I like a filbert brush because I like the organic shapes that it gives me. I might stop using as much water. Now I'm still going to use the black, and I'm just going to mix some white in with it, just a little bit of white. It doesn't take much white to lighten that value quite a bit. And then I'm going to hold my brush up to the canvas and squint my eyes to see if that brush disappears. Like for example, this brush, the end of the brush that has that dark gray on it, when I put it over the white area of her fur, you can see that dark gray quite easily. But if I hold it up over some of these brownish areas and squint my eyes, it starts to disappear. It looks lighter than the black areas. And so this is how we can kind of compare and make sure our values are fairly close. Now I'm going to lighten this up just a smidge for some of these areas of her fur where it meets the black, especially along the back here. I'm just going to give the hint of some of that texture without being too detailed. And then I'll have to go back in and lighten up the values for the lighter areas in a little bit. But for now, I'm just creating some of these mid-tone values, this darker gray. And don't forget, that black is going to dry a little bit lighter than it needs to be, so I need to darken that up a smidge as well. My drawing, as I said before, was not a perfect drawing. It was basically just a sketch using those circles. So as I go in now, I might be more careful and pay attention to kind of some of those shapes of where the bones of her head would come in. To create kind of that form for her. I'm just going to paint all of this stuff in here a little darker, and then I'll add the light areas afterwards, including this kind of an eyebrow shape that she has. There's kind of like a triangle on her forehead there. Again, I'm going bigger with my darks than I need to. I can always go back in and lighten up a little bit later. But I also am going to have to darken up a little bit some of those darker areas. And I just want to push it in to make sure I'm filling in any of those holes in that canvas, whether I'm using oil or acrylic, doesn't matter. Just going to get a slightly lighter value. Check it out for some of those brown colors. Maybe that was a little too light. I'll add a little bit more of that brown and blue to go in and put in this ear. But at this stage, I'm still not worried about abject perfectionism. I'm just getting these shapes in. It's so freeing to be able to paint this way and just be able to go in and paint what I see instead of worrying about perfection. Let me get that whole top half of the eye. The black dot in there I can paint again later. I'm just going to paint around that oval, and I'll get it back in a little bit later. Same with some of the highlights in the back of that fur. I just want to get the basic shapes in there. So I'm kind of getting rid of a lot of that white space. That's really what I'm doing. I'm going to lighten up my color quite a bit with some white. As soon as I start to get a little bit lighter, I don't have to put any water in because I want this to be a little thicker. And I can kind of go more gently around some of the areas that I see. And I like to use my directionality of my brush work in the area I see the fur. So if the fur comes off this way on this part of the face, then I'll paint my strokes in that direction. If I see the fur just kind of matte and not really furry in some other places, I'll just kind of softly put it in without flicking my brush in any one direction. But where I see that brush stroke needing to go like off onto the side here like this, then I'll paint my brush stroke in that direction of the hair. And this kind of comes in towards the ear, this little patch, in that kind of direction. Now, unless you're trying to get a perfect likeness, don't stress out about trying to do a perfect likeness. Just get it to look like a cat. Look at where the dark and the light areas are, and roughly try and get those light and dark areas in there. Again, without stressing out too much about perfection, just getting used to really seeing the values and where those values change. Where does it go from dark to light and everything in between? All the detail will get painted on top of this later. All this white fur, by the way, in the back side of her body here is all darker than you might think. There's no true white other than maybe here, and even that is not a perfect white. We can paint it white, but even that fur, there's just white highlights in it. So I don't stress out about perfection anywhere. In fact, I see a little bit of a darker grayish tone right here and down here. I just paint in what I see, where I see it, and I can keep going back to the main image to get more perfect. I'm still using, you know, this smaller filbert, but I certainly can't do details like in her eye yet. So I'll do those details later. The key here right now is just to put in the big shapes, and that's a lot of times where we can sometimes get messed up a little bit, where we just want to add too much detail too quickly. And instead, just go in and get the big shapes in, and then go in and pick out the details afterwards. Going carefully in some areas where you just want to really refine that drawing and where you see a lot of fur coming out. This kitty, her name is Lily. She's quite an independent cat, and she thinks of herself as being pretty fierce. So that's, I think, definitely being caught in this image here. Now I'm going to go in and reestablish my darks, but because I still got light on that brush, I've got to clean that brush off. Tap it really well on the bottom of that cup of water. Wipe it off on my paper towel. Then I like to squeeze the paint out. So tap it on the bottom of the cup of water again, squeeze it out. I want just black. So that's that brown and blue mixture. And if the paint is still wet, I'm going to have to wait a bit for this step, possibly. Now for my oil painters, you may want to do this ahead of time and let this fully dry for at least maybe say a week or two. A month is even better. Or use some acrylic paint that you might have at home so that this is fully bone dry before you paint on top of it with wet, juicy oil. Just make sure that your painting is put near somewhere it can get some heat. So if you have a fireplace on, you can always, in the evenings, for example, if it's cool where you are, you can always put this painting in front of that fireplace. Or if you have a window that catches a lot of light, you could put this painting in that window so that it will dry quicker. But anytime you water down that paint, you also change that value. You lighten up that value a little bit. So that's why I'm going in here and just making sure that my values are dark enough, because I had water in that first layer. Okay, so just going through. I'm sorry, you can probably hear my son in the background there, playing with his friends. So you might hear him a little bit here and there. I hope it's not too distracting. During the pandemic here, we're all in tight quarters. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move to a smaller brush. I'm using a filbert again, but it's an even smaller one. And I'm just going to go back and forth with some of these darks and lights and pick out some of the areas that are transitionary. So some of these areas like in the eyes or in the in his muzzle, for example. I won't worry about painting all those details on his whiskers quite yet, because I can do that later, and I can do it with a color once I start painting, but it's just going to get lost anyway. So I'm just going to go in here and clean off the brush in between major transitions. I'm going to get some white, come into an area like this one, for example, and paint some white. I still have some wet gray, so where it matches up, it will mix together, and that's okay. I'm going to go between these lines I put in for his whiskers, where the whiskers come out, and then maybe just go up and down a little bit in between them, so it gives the impression of something happening without having to do those little lines of the whiskers, which again I won't do till later. I'm going to get a gray for his eyes, because his eyes are not super bright. They're kind of grayish. And I'm just going to go around, and it looks like a U that I'm making here. With the gray, I'll go back in, clean off my brush, and go in with just a black color to put back in that center of the eye. And a few of the parts that have kind of darkened or lightened up because they were used with water. So I'm just going to clean that brush off again, go back in again because the paint is a little bit wet. And just go back in to that eye. making sure that I reestablish any areas that I'm missing. Same with down in the nose. I'm not doing a ton of detail. This is just a grisaille, but I do want to be able to pick out the main dark and light areas in here. So I'm just going to kind of make sure I go in and don't lose too much of the areas I want to be light or dark. Just bringing out the main areas that I see. And remember that drawing was just some circles and some lines, but even from just circles and lines you can create quite a wide range of shapes that are enough to guide you into this now black and white version of this cat using brown and blue. To create that impression of her markings and a little bit of her personality. Coming through. With the dry brush I can even go in, even with the white, although I'm going to make it a little darker, and just add a few more areas where I think I might have lost some of the detail. And then just go back and forth until you get to a place where you really feel that your picture is giving the impression of this animal. Again, I'm not looking for a perfect likeness of this cat. I'm just looking for something that's going to be similar. Now, what you can do at any point is also get in some of that background. I'm going to go back to my bigger brush, and I'm going to show you here, if I mix just a very light gray and I go to the top of this background, see how light it is? This color disappears a little bit on that background, so I'm right there, but down here, look at how much darker it is. So down in this bottom corner, the color is darker. So I've got to mix my gray and my white, my black and my white, I should say, that mix of blue and brown and white, and go back and see, ooh, a little too dark. Add a little bit of white. Try it again. Much closer now. In fact, it's very close to the color of her fur there, which is part of the reason why her fur starts to disappear. And all those little hairs, I can go back in with some of those darker hairs now that I realize I wasn't dark enough there. Now that I've started painting some of this in, and I can fix it, some of those darker and lighter hairs. And then again, I'm just going to go carefully around her. Getting rid of any of the white space. And this will become the base for my next painting, which will be painted right on top of this with color. Notice now I'm adding a little bit of white to my color so that as I move up the canvas, and I do need to add some water to this. This is just a little too dry down here right now. And I can go back and forth and add some more of that fur back in so that the fur sits on top of that background too as I go along. But for now, I'm not going to worry about it too much. And I'm just going to continue to lighten my color, adding a little bit of water as necessary. I don't want the paint to be watercolor. I want it to be acrylic, so it's going to have some thickness, and we want it to be opaque. And I'm not going to be too precious as I go around my picture, because it's a painting, not a photograph. These big brushes hold a lot of paint, so sometimes you have to use quite a bit more paint. I might have to throw some more onto my palette. And I want to get lighter up in that top area, so I'm going to add more white. Scrub it in so I'm getting rid of any of those white areas of that canvas cleaned out. And that's how I paint the grisaille. A black and white version of my painting. I could go back and forth, really studying my picture, trying to see where the color gets lighter, more white, especially in the eye, and especially in some of those areas of fur. Actually, I should get darker first and put some of this back in. Some of that dark area down here. So it's just a back and a forth. Always assessing where you're at and what needs to change. What do we need to do to make this more similar to the reference photo? But without trying to worry about making it a photograph. Instead, focusing on making this a nice impression of the cat with paint. This bottom of the area is quite light. There's a little highlight up there, so I'll put that in. And putting in some of those lights, I'm going to wipe off my brush and just dry brush the edge of those lights so they look like a better transition. And I got to darken up the top half of that eye. It's gotten a little too light here on me. Now that I've got the light in, now she looks really vicious. And go back and forth again and just continually kind of look at my picture, stand back from my painting, stand back from the photo, and look at both and make sure that I'm not missing anything. Make sure that if I am, I go in and I correct it. Make sure I get those light areas light enough, but not so light. Light enough that, again, you can really see that it's this cat. And it looks similar enough, but not perfect. I could do this all day. Going back and forth. Making sure that I get all the main elements in here. But I don't want to obsess too much. This is a good exercise for practicing brushwork and also really assessing those values. Making sure that you're on the right track. But then I'll use the color to go back in afterwards. Okay, so my demo now that I have this grisaille done is going to be to show you how to layer the color on top and how to use that grisaille to help find your values. So I'm going to start with the background this time and then put the cat on top so that fur can really sit over on top of those edges. So I can paint it exactly like the picture and just have it be those creamy colors, or I could choose any color I wanted to. As long as my darks were this dark and my lights were this light, I'd be just fine. So I could really choose any colors that I wanted to use. I could even create a pattern and make it look like a wallpaper or something. So I'm going to start off with mixing up a color. I'm going to start with the darker value, and I'm going to start with that brown and white. I'm going to add a touch of that yellow to it. And I might make this, I want to make sure that even if I don't do exactly the same color that's in the sample painting, or sample photo I should say, that it's not too close to the cat color, or she will disappear in that background. So I noticed that there's some green tones to it, and that's because of the photo, I'm assuming, because of the digital photo. But I kind of like the colors that are there already, so I'm going to go that direction. So I'm adding some green to this beige. Green is yellow and blue. To that mix of brown and white. Obviously my value is going to be too dark here, but I'm just starting in a place where I can see if I'm leaning in the right direction. Still want to add a little bit more yellow to this color and maybe a touch more blue. The yellow will tone down a little bit once I put the white in there, but I'm going to go more greenish, kind of like the green tones against the reds of her furs. I think will be nice. I might exaggerate the greens even.
So I started off with kind of a beige, thinking there was more brown and white in there, but as I mix, I can see that really it really is more greenish. I'm getting much closer. If I blur my eyes when I put this palette knife over that edge, I can see it's close, but I'm going to go a little lighter. That's a good place to start. Now this demo is in acrylic paint, so I'll have to mix it on the fly as I go along, and I want to make sure that I always have fresh paper towel or rags to wipe off my palette knife and my brush as I work, because everything will dry out so quickly. I'm going to dry off my palette knife, and then I'm going to start the painting process using a nice big brush just to lay in the color. I want to dampen the brush, but I don't want it too wet because now I'm painting on top of these grays. Now I can see that the value is lighter than what I had before. Maybe I was too dark with my grays there, but I think this is pretty close to what I need, so I'm going to stick with it. The value that I painted to start with was really a good place to start, and I can use that to really help guide my picture as I go along, but I also don't have to be totally married to it. I can change it, but having that grisaille, the point is to know where your darks and lights are so that things kind of make sense. And I'm going to go a little bigger than I need to go here. I'm going to paint right over on top of my cat a little bit because I can always edit it later. And now as I'm painting, the paint is starting to run out, but that's okay because now I want to start getting a little bit lighter with my color. So as I go, I'm going to add more white to the color. And I'm just going to get a little bit lighter as I go along. Not a lot of water is mixed in with this color. And because I'm working fairly quickly and wet into wet, I just can continue adding some white, letting this color get a little bit cooler as it goes up to the top. Again, getting rid of any grays. Cooler and lighter without much water, because I want to overlap all these grays. I don't want to see the grays through. The grays were there just to help guide my values for the drawing. But I need a touch of water as I'm mixing, just a touch. Again, I don't want to see those grays through here, but I do need to be able to cover them up too. So it's that balance. Maybe add a touch of yellow and just warm it up a smidge. I'm really pushing and wiggling into those holes so I cover that gray. And it doesn't have to be perfect. If I have a little bit of the gray showing through, it's not the end of the world because it's the same value. It just might kill the color a little bit, and I want to make sure I go over these furry areas here so that I can paint that fur right on top of it. I'm just going to go in and kind of smooth out some of my brush strokes. I want them to be a little bit painterly, but they don't have to be perfect. So I'm going to go back and forth with a few little strokes and just kind of model that color a little bit. Lightening up here, maybe a smidge more. Okay, so there's the background of my cat. Now, if you do want to go in and create some texture, like make it look like this is a wallpaper, you could do that while this is wet. I'm going to put that big brush in the water and maybe just go to a slightly smaller brush. And this is where I could do that if I wanted to have some, let's say, stripes or some filigree or something in it. I just have to be careful about doing it the same values as, in the shadows as in the highlights. So I have to shift it the same way. So if I wanted to, let's say, create lighter sort of pattern in here, let's imagine it's some sort of, oh, I don't know, I'm just going to make this up. Some sort of pattern kind of like this, where it's kind of a oval with a couple of. Now notice how I have to get lighter as I go up into this lighter area so that the pattern shows up. So as I go higher up, I've got to get lighter with my pattern. So it might have been darker down below, more of that original color, but just a little bit of a lighter showing through. Give that an idea of a pattern in that background, but adding more white as I go higher up. So I still get the pattern showing, but the pattern isn't quite that much of a contrast compared to what it was down below. That's the key here, is I want to make sure that the contrast level is similar. And really in a wallpaper it would have been offset, but that's okay. I'm just giving you the idea of how you could create something that maybe isn't there in the picture, but you can create this sense of texture in the background. And you could do the same thing with imagining that maybe there was some sort of, let's go back to our original background color. You could imagine that maybe there was a darker sort of a pattern inside and in between. So you can just create this impression of something going on without being exact. So letting it be a little bit looser, a little freer. Something that's not perfect, and just gives the idea of some texture in that background. Again, I'm not saying you guys need to do this. I'm just giving you this idea of how you could take that background from being just a flat background and kind of create this impression of some sort of value change, like there's a wallpaper with some sort of texture in it. And with acrylic, I'm constantly putting out new paint. Now my folks who live in hot areas, and even my folks who live here in the Northwest, some of you might prefer to add some fast dry or some slow dry medium, it's called a retarder, to your paint. That's totally up to you. I don't use a fast dry, or sorry, pardon me, a slow dry medium or retarder in my paint because I don't like how goopy it makes the paint feel, and it starts to feel sticky after a while. So I prefer to just use paint and just keep mixing on the fly, and it helps make me a better colorist because I really have to constantly be mixing and trying to get the right color. If I had mixed and it was completely wrong, the colors were totally off, then what I would have to do is just make sure I put the new color in everywhere. So mixing enough with acrylic paint is really important. Making sure your mixes are big enough to continue on where you need them to continue. So now I'm going to go into my little cat. And I like to start with my darkest values first, so that's where I'll start. My darks are like black, and that's just a mixture of the brown and the blue. So clean off my brush. Go in, and now I've got my mixture of black, and I had already painted some black on here because this was a grisaille and I was using black tones, but I'm using a little bit more brown now, and so I'm just gonna paint over my blacks again just to make sure that there's color in them. They're a little bit browner maybe because this cat has a lot of brownish tones, so brown and blue mixed together with quite a bit of that brown, but also to make sure that my blacks are really nice and dark, because the first layer of the grisaille was a little bit more watery and might have disappeared a little bit. So again, just filling in those darks so they're really nice and dark, really nice and dark. And I'm using a filbert brush for this, about this width compared to the painting, so roughly about the same width as the eye really is what this brush is, so depending on how big or how small you're working. And what I want to start doing is really introducing some of the shadow colors in the browns and also in these furry areas here too, and you can really see how warm those furry areas are here. Warm color temperature being more similar to what I'm seeing in the wall actually. Now if this was in life I might see something a little differently, but I have to rely on the photo, and so that's the downside of working from photos, is that you really are beholden to what you see in this photo, whereas if you work from life, you can get a much more accurate color. So this value is very light, so I mixed kind of a greenish with a brown to dull down that green, and I'm just going to go and I'm going to see, is it roughly the same value here? Well, if I squint my eyes, does it kind of disappear on there? It sure does. So I'm just going to paint this in right here in this area where I see those shadows where it gets a little bit darker. I'm just going to add a little bit more blue and brown for a kind of a grayish tone to bring in some of those darker values, especially right under here at that muzzle. And then again, go back to the lighter areas and carve around it if necessary. So wherever I see it, I paint it, and I don't worry about detail. I'm holding the brush quite a bit farther back. I'm not holding it up here and painting like a pencil. I'm painting with the brush. So I'm holding it farther back, and I'm standing over my canvas so I can see everything, see the forest for the tree, so to speak. And then I'm just going to keep lightening as I go, wherever I see it. If I can work wet into wet as much as I can, I will. But I do want to get up into some of these tones before I go too far on this fur. So I just wanted to get the shadowy areas of that fur in color. And now I want to go into some of the fur color. Now we can see that it's kind of a brown or red color. So if I take my brown, and I'm going to use my palette knife here to make sure I have enough brown and my orange, and I'm going to mix an orange on the side, and then little by little introduce this orange into my brown. Now that's a dark color so far, so I'm going to add more yellow to this orange. That yellow will help lighten up my color. I'm trying to avoid using white until I absolutely have to, because the white just goes in and kills your color a little bit. This is a very nice warm orangey brown, a little too warm. I'm going to get some white to lighten it up, and that will instantly start to help dull down that color. If I need more yellow, I add more yellow. If I need more orange, I'll add more orange. I think I needed more yellow there. And it's just a back and a forth with how much brown versus how much yellow versus how much red mixed in to figure out where I need to be. And I think I need more yellow. I think I'm getting closer here. Still pretty warm, but that's good. That's a good starter. And I'm going to take a little bit of that and add some more brown for my darker mix where I need those shadows. And if I make the pile big enough in acrylic, it won't dry out too quickly for me here to do this demo. So I'm going to wipe off that palette knife, put it aside for later, start with this darker brown and start going into some of these areas. Ooh, that's kind of light. Maybe I need to darken it just a smidge more. There we go. Now if I need to switch to a smaller brush, I will. I'm just going to switch to a smaller brush just to get into some of these small nooks and crannies as well with this color. And I'm using this existing painting as my roadmap, and then every now and then making sure that I look at what's happening in the photo as well. Again, I'm not worried about a perfect likeness of my kitty here. I just want to create a cat picture. Now, if you're worried about likeness, that could be one of the trickier things in painting. I always tell people, don't worry about the likeness. Try and make it look like an animal first. And then as you continue your painting journey, you tend to get better at getting the shapes right, which makes it look more like the animal you're trying to draw or paint. I'm going to add some of these furs. I'm always going to start on the inside of the head and flick the brush upward to get some of those darker fur areas in right now. I can go back and forth with my darks if I need to. In fact, I'm just going to do that whole nose this color. And I can put the lights on top as I go. Where else do I see this? I see this up here, especially in this area. I'm going to flick down into the fur of the head. And I see it right around the tip of that ear. I'm just using these little strokes that are kind of in the shape of that ear, in the hopes that I don't have to do much finessing later. Okay, some of these little bits. I might dull these ones down a smidge with some blue, because these are in shadow. And again, I gotta get the paint thick enough that I can overlap the gray and the gray doesn't show through. It's okay if little bits of the gray are coming through, but I don't want too much of the gray. So I am mixing bigger blobs of paint. I'm gonna go straight to that, whatever's left on my brush, and add more blue and brown for a darker version of this color yet again, just to help kind of give me some darker brown dots in here. I think that was just a little too bright. And the only way to know it is to paint it on there. Squint your eyes. Does it match what you were trying to paint before? And then blend it in. Wherever else you might see it, start to paint it in there. And the inside of that eye is quite dark. I might have to go in and darken that up again as well, but that's okay. To start, just putting things in where I see them. That's this darker version of brown with more brown and blue mixed in. That's how I'm seeing it, so I'm going to paint it that way. I'll have to go back in with my blacks and expand them a little bit later. So my black again is just a mix of the blue and the brown, and I was using a little bit more brown this time. So now I can go back in and again finesse some of my darks, go back and forth. That grisaille underneath is my guideline for where everything needs to go, but I can absolutely adjust as necessary. And while my paint is wet, it blends a little bit. And if it doesn't, you just dry brush. So either way, with acrylic, the nice thing is that ease of layering, because we do have that slower dry time, that faster dry time, pardon me. Thinking and painting. Some days I'm better at it than others, so I apologize if I say something incorrectly. Don't judge me too harshly. Okay, so just going to continue on to some of those lighter values that I've already pre-mixed, which I see here. Kind of sculpts the shape of the face a little bit. I think my color's too bright, so I'm going to add some more white and brown to it. I think my original mix was just a little too vibrant, so I'm adding some of the brown and then some of the white to help lighten it up, because I want the value to be the same as it was. I just don't want the color to be quite so vibrant. And again, just kind of following where I saw in the beginning when I painted that grisaille. Where did I see those lighter values? Where did I see those darker values? Painting them in. Not worried about perfection. Thinking about the directionality of my strokes. How does that fur curve? Where does it curve? I'm trying to paint it in that way. So moving my brush is necessary. Still holding my brush fairly far back so that I'm not doing anything too perfectly, so that everything is a little bit imperfect. Just getting the general regions correct. And I will have to go in later and do a little bit more value shifts as well. This is not going to be the end of my layering. And all those light hairs I'll paint in a little later. Excuse me. Okay. That flicking motion, that pushing and flicking of the brush to create these kind of hairy strokes, it's very handy. And I'm always thinking in which direction the fur lies when I'm adding these strokes. And the darks were bigger than they needed to be, so that now I can overlap and flick the brush up off the canvas like a plane taking off the runway. And what's lovely about that is it just gives me that nice transition between darks and lights. And it helps it look softer and a little fluffier, like fur actually would be. Now some of these browns are a little bit more grayish. I'm just going to put a hint of some of those reddish browns in there, but I'm going to change up my color a little bit, because those are lighter and a little grayer. These are very warm. These are warm, but they have some grayish tones in them too. I'm going to put some of this reddish brown, just a touch of it down in here. I almost see like a hint of it showing. So I'll put that in. And then I'm going to start taking this color. I'm going to corral what's left of this together into a blob and start graying it out a bit. Just by adding white, I'm going to start graying it out. Again, I'm mixing more paint than I need because it's very helpful. Then I can go back in and use it again and add more brown and a touch more yellow. That's looking pretty close. Wipe off my palette knife in between each step to make sure that it's clean, because that metal edge I want to keep in case I want to paint with that metal edge. I'm going to put out some more yellow real quick in case I need it. Yellow and brown are starting to get low, so is that white. I'm constantly putting out more paint, just because if I'm too precious with how much paint I've got sitting on my palette, I'm going to be more precious in the way that I'm mixing the colors, and then I might not have enough color to actually paint with. That's a big problem. So, okay. Take my brush and push and wiggle it into this new mix. This is a lighter value and a little duller, and I do see some of it here in the nose. And a line of it there. Just wherever I see it, I'm going to go in and start painting it. And I can always lighten again, especially depending on what kind of brand you're using. If you're using a really inexpensive brand of acrylic paint, like Liquitex, especially if it's really inexpensive, like Liquitex Basics, the color is going to dry quite a bit darker. It's called color shift. And that's because there's just so much binder and so little pigment. The more pigment you have, the less color shift you'll get. So always buy the best quality paint you can afford. Even if you just end up buying these few colors like I've shown you here. These few colors, you can make most of the color you need, and then you won't have that same issue with color shift, or it won't be as bad. There still might be that same issue, but not quite as bad as it would be with the really inexpensive paint. And even some really good painters that I know use really inexpensive paint, and I just think, gosh, they're hamstringing themselves. They can still make it work really nicely, so that's got to tell you something. But gosh, it just takes so much more paint. It costs you more in the long run just to do anything. So I'd rather use less paint and use better quality paint and get what I want out of my painting. Notice how, again, these strokes I'm making, they're more up and down and trying to make them look more furry. So I'm really paying attention to the directionality of these strokes to make it look like her fur. But anyways, I digress. I just think buy the paint you can afford. If all you can afford is Liquitex Basics, by all means buy Liquitex Basics. You don't want to get in your own way of painting. But if you can afford a better quality paint, you are going to find your paintings will just be so much better because of it. You'll be able to control the color so much better. And put a little bit of blue in here and gray this out a little bit here. Gray out that brown with some blue. So I always recommend use the best brush you can afford. And then don't stress out about it if you can't. Someday maybe you will be able to. And then you can upgrade and you will notice a big difference. I'm just mixing a slightly darker version of this blue and brown to create this kind of grayish color that I'm seeing here. This is a little bit darker, maybe some more brown and blue to just make it darker inside of there. There's a complexity of these fur. I don't want to go in and create every little piece of fur. All I want to do is create the hint, the few little lines. Notice how I'm just kind of hovering over my canvas here and flicking back and forth to create this impression of these furry lines of her fur. So no perfection needed or warranted. I say that all the time. I know it probably drives people crazy, but I firmly subscribe to that theory. Okay, now all of this stuff in shadow, it's very much kind of that greeny grayed out brown. So I'm going to gray out my browns, my darker version and my lighter version. My lighter version, I might need to add some more white in there. Start with the darker version. After cleaning off my brush, I just wipe it off. I'm going to come in here and do the inside of the ear. To create that shadow. Getting a little darker as I get towards the center, so I'm going to stay away from that center right now. And then get a little darker as I go into the center, so that when I do paint those little hairs, oops, I need a little more brown in that color. Those hairs will really show up against this dark center of the ear. So I might just paint over all of that right now. I mean, I can just paint those white hairs right back on top, and frankly, that's going to be a little easier, I think, than trying to worry about painting around those little white hairs and then go back in and overlap in the right places. So I'll just paint the light on top of this a little bit later. So I'm going to go into this color again, this brown, and I've got the blue, maybe a touch of that orange mixed into it so it doesn't lose all that color. And now I'm going to do this back part of the fur, and again, now I'm starting to overlap some of the dark and the background, so I'm really going to pay attention to my strokes. My brush, I pushed and wiggled into it. It's not super thick and goopy, and it's a little bit tacky, meaning it's dried up a little bit, so I can just go in and go back and forth. The brush might be a little bit dry, but then I get that nice kind of furry look to it that I want. Now I'm going to put some more darks in between this area here. So I'm going to go back to my blue and brown mixture and just go in and, oops, maybe get a little darker. Go back in between those two areas and bring that back in. Cleaning off my brush if needed. want to go back to that black up at the top of her head and pay more attention to the fur up here where it starts to kind of flick out and up a little bit. Even along the top edge of her ear. Just make sure that my directionality of my strokes is working so that it really looks like fur. And then again, adding a few of those strokes of that black back on top of that lighter tone that I put in there. So I'm going back and forth all the time with my darks and my lights to try to create that complexity of that fur, hopefully. Nothing's ever guaranteed in this business. You know, you do your best. And sometimes you get lucky and it works out, and that's always such a good feeling. Now that I've got this dark color, I'm going to come back in here to the eye. It's really dark right there, that crease of the eye. And even underneath of it a little bit, I just want to make sure I'm shaping it just right. So I get that nice deep part of her eye. Now I'm just going to continue now, continue to lighten that orangey brown that I wanted to gray out a bit. So I had added a little bit, just a little bit of the blue and a bunch more white, making sure that I still have enough orange so that the color isn't too dead. And just make sure that I've lightened up all of the areas I want lightened enough. So I'm going to lighten that even more. Actually, just a bit more orangey with the white, because the white and that orange is going to just get really light and peachy. So I'm going to go into where I see it really light and make sure those light areas are nice and light the way I want them. And that the more values you have in there, the more the darks and lights, the more something's going to start to really look 3D and more realistic. And then, of course, the directionality of your strokes really matters. So which direction are you going with those marks that you're making? There's like this greenish tone in here, in the shadow, just like over there, that kind of greenish brown that I had mixed. So I'm going to go in here with that greenish brown that I still have left. And just go in and dull out this part of her fur a little bit with that greenish brown. And that way it ties in nicely with the shadows over here. Might even use some of these greenish brown tones, maybe a darker greenish brown tone over in here. Little bits of it on the edge of her head where it's turning away from the light. And that gives us a color complexity where we're talking about warms and cools. It just leans on one side of the color wheel or the other, but don't let that stress you out too much. If that's something that you're just going like, I don't see it, I don't know what she's talking about, skip it. Don't worry about it. Just get your darks and your lights in there. If your color is slightly off, as long as your darks and your lights are in the places they need to be, you can fudge color a little bit. Color can be a little bit wrong and it'll still work. It'll still read as what you're trying to have it read as. So I've lightened up this this grayish tone. I'm going to put in like one layer of some of these furs. Again, I'm still holding my brush farther back, pushing it, and then pulling it off the canvas as I come around to where I want that fur to be. So I'm just continuing on. I dropped my paintbrush. I had a call come in. I should have turned my phone off, but so I just got to clean that up. But while it's wet, the nice thing about an acrylic painting, while it's wet, you can just wipe it off. So I'm just going to go back in here now with my black mixture. And just reestablish it. Ooh, looks like I have a little bit of that grayish color, even right here in the shadow of that ear. And even some of this is some of that grayish color coming around. So I'm going to take that grayish brown. I'm just going to paint this patch with the grayish brown and introduce some of that lighter, warmer orangey tone into it. So grayish brown and the orange mixed together to kind of help marry the two together a little bit. Okay, Now this here, this area, this little triangle, it's also that marriage of the grays and the oranges that goes right up into this dark patch with a rough edge. And then that lighter patch is underneath of it, and I want that lighter patch to come up over this a little bit and kind of marry it a little bit. So I'm going to take some more of that greeny tone, because it was a little bit more greenish under there, and add it to this color. I'm going to have to lighten it up a little bit and come back in here. I've mixed a color that's similar to that, but not exact. It's close enough. And there's kind of like these little stripes. So I'm just going to paint those in there as like little striplets-ish. And some of this color too might show up in some of this other fur where it overlaps some of that dark. And maybe even this mid-tone fur here, where it starts to come down over top of some of this darker fur. This might be the darker version of that fur in the long run. I'm going to add some more white, some blue and brown, a little yellow, just to get more grayish here. But still it has color because it has a little bit of that orangey mix in it. So it will read as white in shadow, but I don't want it too gray. It's very similar to this background color. I could always make it more brownish if that bothered me. So I can add more brown to that color instead to brown it up a little bit, so it's not quite as greenish instead. But the greenish tone doesn't bother me too much, to be honest with you, and I kind of like it tying into that background. So I'm just going in for some of these darker patches where I see some fur. Painting them in, because I'll paint all the light fur on top of it. Now there's also some dark fur here that's very bluish black. I gotta clean up that brush because I've got so much white on it. Grab another piece of paper towel in the meantime. I'm just going to paint it back in there, that black, and then I'm going to gray it up a smidge, adding more brown so it's not too bluish. Add more brown there for some of these little furs, and they come quite a bit out over onto that that backdrop. So I'm painting them bigger than they need to be because that white fur will sit on top of it. So I've got a mix of that brown and white and also that black and white. Now I'm going to go back into my fur color, and I might even use my palette knife again because I want to make sure I have lots of this light tone for her fur. And I think I do want it to be more kind of leaning towards that yellowy gray tone. So I'm going to add some yellow to this mix of whatever the gray was I had here. I might even grab all this gray and mix it in. And it's going to be, I think I'm going to use all that white for this light. I'm going to leave those, the light of the ears and the light of the eyes here a little bit for a minute. The value is pretty close, but I'm going to add some blue to just clean up that color smidge. And also with that yellow in there, that blue will help lean it a little bit more greeny, which would reflect off of the, if there was wallpaper behind her, it would reflect that. So I'm going to start with this value, which is darker than I need it to be in the end. This is darker than I need it to be in the end. And that way I can just go in and start creating some of these little areas. There's going to be some darker grays in there for that tone of her fur where the whiskers come out. And I might even go in right now and just get a little bit of a darker greeny gray back that I had from before. Just to go back in here and make sure I've got the shadow right underneath that nose area. There's like a little bit of a line of shadow underneath of her nose. And also I'm just gonna, while I've got that darker color, I'm gonna go in and just create some of those dots of where that whisker line will be. So now I can go back to my lighter color and just kind of go in between those whisker areas and put this light down pretty thick. I'll put the whiskers on top with a little detail brush later. Now I can kind of shape that top part of the mouth. It's coming in here and then down on the bottom of her bottom chin, softening up the edge by flicking the brush upward to kind of blur that line a little bit, and then coming back in to flick that brush outward and over top of these dark colors, again paying attention to where there's tufts of hair and what direction they're coming down on, but also where there are groupings of the tufts. So that just little bits of the dark shows through, and there's like a little bits of that light underneath there. So now I'm just going to go in to this shadow, over top of this shadow here, and again looking at where these tufts are. Painting them in, getting rid of the old gray tones that were underneath, but putting aside the idea of perfection here. It doesn't have to look exactly like the photo, especially if this is not a commission, but if this is for you, I'm going to dry brush over top of the bottom edge of all those tufts so that they kind of start to fade in a little bit more and look like they're underneath, with maybe a nice bright line here and there indicating that fur direction. And all this fur here is just a little bit fuzzy looking, so I'm just going to fuzz it up around the edges of where it hits some of those other colors. So it's dry brushed a little bit. The brush is a little drier. And for oil, you know, you could just blend with the colors that are underneath after the fact, because the color will still be quite wet for a while. And then just careful about drying off that brush in between each step if you're working in oil. Okay, so this is still quite a gray here. It's nowhere near white. So I'm saving any whites for just the last few little bits, if necessary. So just creating that impression of where some of those lighter strokes might be hitting. Still using the same brush. I'm actually going to flatten out that nose a smidge. And I might darken up the bottom edge of that nose. That mix of brown and blue. Just bring that back into play. I haven't even touched her eyes yet. I'll do those a little bit later. I see a little bit of a darker grayish tone right underneath of her ears. I'm going to use mostly brown and a little bit of white just to kind of put that little bit of that grayish tone in. It kind of starts to connect here. And there's a little bit of a highlight along this edge of her ear, kind of more brownish mixed with a little bit of that orange. So I still have some of that left. So I'm just going to exaggerate the orange a bit just to bring some of the orange into this left half of her head a little bit more. And I want to darken up that patch that goes right up into the ear. I think that's important, kind of like our earlobes. So I'm just going to extend that dark patch right into there. And I'm going to make sure I don't forget some of these little dark bits inside, just to give structure to the inside of that ear. Okay. Now, what I want to do now is I'm going to go into her eyes and start putting in some of the color in her eyes, which will help pop things out. Use the biggest brush you can for any given area, but then, you know, you might need to switch to a different brush, a smaller brush for some of that. So now is when I start getting in with a smaller brush to work. And her eyes are quite green, and they're very dark in the center and near the top edges. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with the darkest part. I'm going to overlap that black. I'm going to use more blue than brown for that. Paint that eye in. It's flat on this edge and rounded on the right edge. At least that's what I see. I'm going to go right over that dot of the eye. I'm not going to worry about that dot. Go right over it. I'll paint it back in later. And again, I'm painting this dark a little bit bigger than it needs to be, reestablishing some of the dark edges around her eye so that that eye really has lots of contrast. And then the green is going to be a really grayed out green that's going to be quite dark at the top. So I'm going to start with my black. I mixed a little bit of green in with my light gray there, and I'm going to start there and see how the value is. Not quite dark enough, so go back to the drawing board a little bit, darken it up. And at this point, everything else is dry. I'm going to lay this here so I have it a little closer so I can see it, see what's happening. Go in with that darker value first. Then I'm going to start lightening it up about midway, where I would see the light starting to show through a little bit. Lightening it up the most. Oops. And you'll notice I'm holding the brush much closer now to the ferrule. I'm still not touching the ferrule, but I'm much closer than I was. And this eye actually came down in a bit more of a point, like a U shape-ish. Dry off my brush and just kind of dry brush between these two areas. So after I put the color in, just kind of blurring the line a little bit more. And then I'm going to take some white, maybe even a little more blue in that color, and just really lighten up that bottom corner there. Scooping it up so it's nice and thick. It's a little gob of paint. And even with this light gray and the green mix, I'm going to paint a couple of little dots in here before I put in that nice thick white of that eye. Nice thick. Scoop it up and then plop it down. That nice bright highlight. You can even put a bright, there might even be one here too. Nice bright white highlight. Now, when I'm this close, I can go back in again and just say, okay, I really want to extend this nose down just a little bit and darken just that bottom edge just a little bit more. Or, you know, maybe go in and you want to play with some of those grays a little bit and have them be just a little darker here and there in those cracks. Also, if you want to do some really nice fine hairs, you can always use a script liner brush, something like this. This gets me some really nice fine lines. So especially in places like around her head, her eyes and her nose, I should say. The whole thing is her head. I can take that brush and I can go in and just create these very fine little hairs with some of those lighter values, some of those more orangey, grayish values. I'm gonna use that, mix that color again. Not too much water, but a little bit, so I can get some of those little hairs in there and add more detail to a few of these areas where you want there to be detail, if you do. I won't do this around the whole painting, but I might add more detail just around this eye. take that black so that that eye really becomes the focal point. I'm going to smooth out that eye shape again and create this kind of line there. Maybe go in with some of these hairs here with this black color. And even here, creating tiny little dots of lines to make it seem like those are furry little batches of her fur, so that this eye becomes so much more detailed and then draws you in to look at it more. I wouldn't want to do this everywhere. This is the thing. Be careful. If you do this everywhere, then the whole painting becomes way too detailed, and then the eye doesn't always know where to go first. I mean, it's lovely when people do it. I'm not judging. I just want to expand to you how you don't have to do all that detail. You can make it look a little bit more fun and impressionistic, and then just pay attention to those few areas. Now I'm going to put a few of these little lines of fur with this brush. This is the nice thing about this brush. I can create these nice little furry lines, and same with the whiskers. I'm going to turn everything sideways here to do these whiskers, because I'm going to find it easier to just do this and draw my hand downward. And I can do it just with the solid white if I want it to really stand out, to pop out, rather than that gray. So maybe it looks like I have a few hairy fur that are in the back that are shadowed, and a few that are out in front that are brighter. I'll put a little dot there too in her eye. And then, I'm just going to make sure that these are really nice and bright, some of these. Then what I also want to do, oops, and I've got to have some of those hairs coming down this side too, from the other side. I'm going to go in with that smallish brush and add in those nice thick white highlights on her nose. So like right here, I'm going to go in with thicker paint, just kind of go in and really give it that form, just in this top part here. Just a few little directional fur lines of where her whiskers are coming out. So in between those darker patches to really pop that part of her nose out so it really looks more 3D. You can also take some of the white and add a few touches to the front area of the fur, especially near the bottom edge, where it really would catch some of that light. Again, just that flicking of the brush. So I just get that nice dry brush technique so that nothing is too perfect, but instead has a little bit of imperfection into it, adding with a script liner or even just your round brush, hovering your hand above the canvas, either with a maul stick or with your pinky like I'm doing, to give this impression of some of these little furs that are kind of sticking out. So I hope this has been helpful in how to use a grisaille as a base painting so that when you start painting on top of it, you really see the actual painting come through, and you can focus on color and not have to stress out as much about what value to do because you've already done all that hard work.